This lecture will look at the idea of ethics in public relations. If you noticed, a lot of textbooks, including the one we are using, we often combine ethics and legal issues. And the legal issues can be quite tedious and they can go into a lot of detail. So I'm not going to give the overview here. I'll allow you to get that information via your readings. But ethics is a good topic to kind of present a general overview too. So we're going to talk a little bit about ethics today. So we're going to look at what are ethics, some of the professional guidelines that we use in public relations, dealing with news media, and dealing with the legal issues that are connected to ethical problems, and then employee communications. So let's talk about what is ethics. Typically, we define it as a value system by which a person determines what is right or wrong, and that applies to all communication, not just public relations. It is a system in which you use to decide whether something is okay or it's not. And sometimes that system is personalized, and sometimes it's very generalized based on your area of employment. So here's a question. How can a public relations practitioner play the role of an ethical advocate? Really think about that. You are advocating for something. You are promoting a client. How can you play the role of an ethical advocate, one that promotes almost regardless in an ethical way? And when something arises that is maybe against your belief system or is against all belief systems, if you have embezzlement or something along those lines, how do you still advocate for that company or that person in an ethical way? That's something to consider. Now, an ethical advocate is basically operating within an assigned role. So decisions are made based on a series of things. You make decisions, ethical decisions, hopefully, based on what the public needs and wants, what they're interested in, and the interests of your employer or your client. So not only are you trying to satisfy the needs and wants of your public, but also obviously that of your client. Now, in addition to that, you're also going to have professional organization codes of ethics. Depending upon what group you are affiliated with, you are going to likely see a list of requirements or ethical standards in which you need to adhere to. And then in addition to that, you may also have your own personal values. Maybe you've heard of stories in the past, recent or otherwise, that have discussed how somebody has made a stand in their place of employment regardless of the client or the employer's requirements or personal preferences. So maybe you worked in a place where your manager or the company as a whole was not kind to those of a different lifestyle or those of different religious beliefs or those of different political beliefs or what have you, and you took a stand or you saw somebody do such. That would be considered personal values that lead you to make those ethical decisions. Now, if we're talking about written standards, so your personal values may be things that you hold and maybe you don't even realize you hold them. But the written standards, those professional guidelines, those can be more formalized. And if you belong to the biggest of the professional groups in public relations, which again is the PRSA, and we talked about this weeks ago, you're going to see these lists of things that are required or a general rule of thumb for that particular group in terms of ethics. So on the left here you see that there's a list of values that we must adhere to. You advocate for your client in an honest way. You establish your expertise by researching and getting all the information that you need in order to be a true advocate. You have independence connected to it. There's no unethical connections, so conflict of interest, those sort of things. There's an independent advocacy, and you are loyal to your company or to your group or to your firm, and things are fair. Okay, so these are the general values that the PRSA puts in written format. Now, in terms of provisions, those are some things to consider as well, things that you want to think about when you find yourself in certain situations where you think to yourself, maybe I'm not in an ethical situation here, or I have to make an ethical decision. For example, if you see over here, we have the conflicts of interest. Let's say I know a guy who worked at a track, and he was an employer there, and he also had the ability to license insurance for that company. Well, is it a conflict of interest that he licensed the insurance for the company he works for? Because he's also the person that makes a decision about which insurance company to go with. So there is an issue that could arise there in terms of conflicts of interest. Now, maybe it is an issue, maybe it's not. It depends on that company and how they do their business. But that is something to think about, whether that would violate a conflict of interest. And there are others, but that's just a good example of one of them. Now, another thing to think of are general codes of conduct, and those are some of the things that you will see on websites for these professional organizations like the PRSA or the International Association of Business Communicators. All of those will set standards of ethical behavior in the public relations professions. You can even sign a form that says you will adhere to these. Now, are you obliged to adhere to those things, and will you be in trouble if you don't? Not by the PRSA or the IABC, but in your company maybe you will. However, this isn't something that they can police, so it is difficult, and there is no real consequence from these organizations for not adhering to their codes of conduct. It's more of an educational tool than it is really a legal document. Now, in individual practice, you're going to see things in another way. So ethics in public relations begin with that individual, and it's directly related to his or her own value system as well as the good of society. So when you do things individually, when you make decisions either based on your own personal beliefs or on your beliefs as they relate to your company, that's going to be based on your own system, your own value determination, and sometimes that will conflict with what your company or your client adheres to. So again, going back to some of those examples I gave earlier, maybe you have a belief system that conflicts with the practices of your company. Your company does not allow anybody of a different lifestyle to be employed there, or maybe they kind of talk down to those that are different from you. That could be something that you encounter and have to deal with. Now, on a more broad scale note, as opposed to an individual issue, we also have to consider ethics when we deal with the news media. Now, oftentimes people think of public relations as shady, more like lobbyists as opposed to advocates. And the language there is pretty hazy if you really think about it. But if you really spend time considering ethics and public relations, there's actually quite an interesting thought process that occurs there. You have to establish trust with the media. If you continue to advocate for your client through unethical or maybe even borderline language in your, say, your press releases or your conversations with various journalists, you're going to lose a sense of trust with that journalist and then cause additional issues. So you want to create that sense of trust with the media so that there's a continuing working relationship, and that requires transparency. So even though it sounds like a public relations practitioner could very easily be unethical and shady in some way, it's actually not beneficial to the PR advocate or the PR rep to do that, because once it gets caught more than once or even just the one time, you can ruin a relationship with the media and spin your company in the opposite direction you want to go. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, really quickly before we end here, let's talk about the basics of public relations in the law. Like I said, I want you to spend a little bit more time on this through reading, but there are some general things to keep in mind. I'm sure many of you have heard of the idea of defamation, and there's two general formats, for defamation: libel and slander. Libel is when you write something that is false about a person or a group, and slander is when it's spoken. So you see in, say, a website from a news organization that writes up a piece and they are considered libelous. That could be because that was a written inaccurate statement or proven false statement that was purposefully false written in the website. Whereas slander is more, say, a marketing campaign where somebody is submitting a press release verbally and they say something that is slanderous. Unfortunately, you see lots of slander in politics, especially in 2016. So avoiding libel suits, you want to keep a couple of things in mind. Try to avoid false statements, because when you actively pursue false statements or you blindly make claims without proof, you can find yourself in a lot of trouble depending upon who decides to pursue it. Identify or identifiable traits of a person or a group can be risky if you have agreed not to make statements. So giving very identifiable information can be an issue. Negligence on your part, or if you actually cause someone injury, or you're actually injured yourself. Those are all cases in which you can file for a libel suit. So these are all things that would qualify. So these are some things to keep in mind. Let's end here with some employee communication discussion, and that is what you are entitled to as an employee, not just as a public relations employee, but any employee. What are you entitled to in terms of the communication that you practice in your place of employment? Now, product publicity and advertising is something that you should really keep in mind. The other day I was at the library and my son was playing, and one of the librarians came around and took a bunch of pictures of the kids playing. And I don't know if she saw me or not, but she started to walk away, and I looked over at her, and then she happened to see me out of the corner of her eye, and she said, "Oh, do you mind if I put these on our Facebook page?" And I didn't mind. That was okay. But had she not caught my eye, she would have put his picture, my 5-year-old son's picture, up on the Facebook page without my permission. That's actually not allowed. You are not permitted to do things like that, because it is not a public situation in which that person expects to lack privacy, especially when they're a child. So there is oftentimes permission required from a company when they take your picture or write down things that you said. They need your permission to publicize that. And I don't just mean your permission to publicize it to the mass media. Even in, say, a news release within the company, a company newsletter or something like that, they need to have your permission to put your picture or claims that you make in those situations. So that's something to keep in mind if you find yourself showing up in advertisements for your company or on their Facebook page and you're uncomfortable with that. They are legally not allowed to do that without your permission. So there's something to keep in mind. Also, employee-free speech. This is difficult because you can really walk a fine line here. Employees do have the freedom of expression. They have the right to state disagreements or feelings of unhappiness with their company. However, you can incite riots and things like that. So there are fine lines to it, but it is something that you have a right to. You also, again, have a right to privacy. So you should be able to be in expected situations of privacy where your comments or images are not used in a public manner. You also have the right to whistleblow, which you will see a lot of this in the news, where somebody has blown the whistle on something a company is doing and they go into a legal battle over it. Now, employees are limited in expressing opinions within the corporate environment. Oftentimes there's a disclosure that people will sign that you cannot release information. Usually this happens when there are companies that are trying to get things produced and are fighting legally over the rights to those productions. So there's things like that to consider, but for the most part, you do have a freedom of speech. In some cases, again, you walk a fine line, but it is something that you should have the right to. So hopefully this gave you a general overview of ethics and a little bit of legal issues that are connected to those things. Again, if you have questions or if you want to dive deeper into any of this, take a look at your textbook and see what you've got there, because there's lots more information with some really good current examples. Thanks, guys. See you on the discussion board.